Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Be sure to join our network and get involved in the work that we are doing. If you can, please like and subscribe. It helps us build this channel, which serves as a platform to communicate with our members. This video is part of our 2025 annual conference. We're looking for folks to be on the conference planning committee. Please email info@housingoregon.org.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Gina, Rizk. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm an education and outreach coordinator with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. I work primarily in the Portland metro area as well as the city of Salem, but not the rest of Marion County. I am joined today by Marlee Baker.
Hello everybody, my name is Marlee Baker, my pronouns are they, them. I am also an education outreach coordinator for the Portland metro regions. I've been with FHCO for 3 years, and now I primarily coordinate our bus tours that present a history of housing discrimination here in Portland, and I also oversee our communications, and we are very excited to be here with you today.
All right. So before we get started, we do have a really quick disclaimer just because of all of the federal policy things that are happening right now. This presentation is funded under OHCS, meaning not federal funding. The author and publisher are solely responsible for the accuracy of these statements and interpretations contained in this publication. Marlee and I did not create, but greatly refurbish this presentation, and such interpretations do not reflect the views of the federal government necessarily. So, here is what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk a lot about how Oregon's history of displacement, segregation, and harassment influence housing inequity today. We're going to learn why folks live where they live. It's not random. It's not because they choose to live with their own kind or something like that. We're going to talk very specifically about why people live in the regions they do and why Oregon's demographics look the way that they do currently. We're going to talk a little bit about the resilience and agency of historically displaced groups. We find that in a lot of presentations like this one, this is something that gets overlooked, so we do want to emphasize that. We're also going to explore current policies and practices that address inequity in our communities today. A little bit of a note here about content and language. We are going to be discussing instances of racial violence in this presentation. You're going to see images that contain language that is considered offensive today. These are historical quotes, and they're used to illustrate Oregon's history more clearly for you. Of course, if you need to, you are welcome to take a break. You're welcome to take care of yourself however you need to during the course of this presentation. So we want to start off today with a little bit of vocabulary. These are probably terms that you have heard before, but we do want to define them for the purposes of this presentation. So the first term we're going to define today is race. So we are using race as socially constructed categories that label groups of people based on shared physical traits. We want to emphasize socially constructed, categories as well, and we're going to elaborate on this a little bit more. Next is racism. So we define racism as the belief that one race is inferior or superior to another, which is perpetrated and reinforced in society through the implementation of racist policy. So through the implementation of racist policy is the part that we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to talk a lot about intentional federal policy and how that impacts segregation. Discrimination, unjust and prejudicial treatment towards individuals who share a social class or identity, which can occur interpersonally and systemically. Again, we're going to put a big emphasis on this systemically part. Of course, this is a big part of discrimination as well, but we're going to be mostly talking about systemic discrimination today. And then kind of the result of all of these concepts, right? We kind of see a little flow chart happening here. At the bottom is racial inequity, which is unequal access to wealth and resources due to racial discrimination. We only have one more page of vocabulary, I promise. So Segregation is the act of physically separating services and housing based on the occupant's race. We're going to talk a lot about housing, but we're also going to talk about access to services, economic opportunity, and things like that. Gentrification, this is a word we've all heard a lot, and it has a lot of different definitions and a lot of things that go into what gentrification is and what it looks like. But for the purposes of today, gentrification is defined as the process whereby wealthy people move into a poor neighborhood, and only then resources are introduced to the community, often leading to the displacement of the original residents. So a lot of the times when we think of this idea of gentrification, we think of the idea of populations being priced out. We're going to talk about why that is. Why are prices going up, right? And a lot of the time it is because of this separation of services and economic opportunity, right? Now, in reference to segregation, we're going to use two different terms to kind of specify. So, de jure segregation would be segregation that is legally recognized and legally enforced. So de jure is practices that are legally recognized, right? So de jure segregation is segregation that is enforced by the government. De facto segregation, so de facto is Latin for a matter of fact. The myth of de facto segregation is essentially, it refers to the belief that people self-segregate based on preference. Right? This is a myth that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about why this myth exists and why it is not true. We're going to talk a little bit about miscegenation laws. Miscegenation laws are laws that prohibit interracial marriage. In reference to housing, these were put in place mostly to prevent property from being passed to non-white spouses and children. And we're also going to talk about cost burden. Cost burden is when a person pays more than 30% of their monthly income toward their housing costs, whether this be their rental payments, their mortgage payments, utilities, all of the things that go into that. Yeah, so there are, thank you for reminding me that. Okay, so on your table you will see little packets. These are all slides from our presentation, so if you would like to keep a copy of the presentation, that's a great way to do it. There are also little note slots there if you would like to take notes, jot down questions, anything like that. Oh, also before we get started, this is a lot of information. We're going to try to get through it as efficiently as we can. If we do have time at the end, we will take questions, but we will not be pausing for questions during the presentation, just so that we can get all of the information to you. Okay, so where are we now? What does the current landscape in terms of housing and wealth look like now? So we know that for the average person in the United States, the biggest factor when it comes to generational wealth accrual is the ownership of property, the ownership of housing. So gaps in access to home ownership and gaps in access to property ownership are going to greatly affect the amount of wealth that a certain population is able to accrue throughout generations. So here is a graph that illustrates from 1989 all the way up to 2019 the wealth of white families here at the top and the wealth of Hispanic and Black families here at the bottom. So these little gray areas indicate recessions, right? We see one around 2008, another one around 2002. So we see here that the median wealth of white households is about 7 times the median wealth of Black households at this point in time. And what we're going to be discussing today is why that is. How did we get here? So Oregon currently, as we probably all are aware, is a predominantly white state, and this is not on accident. This is very much on purpose. Nationally, about 13% of the population in the United States of America identifies as African American or Black. In Oregon, that number is under 3%. We get the question a lot about, like, what about Washington? What about California? Those states are a lot closer to the national average of 13% than Oregon is. And there is a very specific reason for this. Not only is Oregon a predominantly white state, but we are also very segregated to this day. So concentrations, there are a lot of concentrations of people with the same race or national origin in certain neighborhoods and communities. And we see that overlap with areas of concentrated poverty. So today, areas with concentrated non-white residents experience the highest levels of poverty and cost burden when it comes to housing. So these metrics are somewhat outdated. 2013, I think, is when this is. But we can see patterns like this that, of course, exist still right now. So these are individual census tracts. So when you see numbers like 0% of households with children, right, this is a specific neighborhood in Clackamas County, not the metric for the entire county. So we'll see that the highest individual poverty rate here is 52.7% in Malheur County, that's out in eastern Oregon. We can see that the minority percentage is 56.9% of the people in this neighborhood are racial minority, and 52% of those have an individual poverty rate. The highest percentage of minority is on this graph is in Washington County, so right outside of Portland. 75.2% of the people in this neighborhood are minorities, and 44.7% of those fall under the poverty rate. If you have a device that's playing right now, if you could silence it, we'd really appreciate it. Oh, it's them? Oh, sorry. I thought someone's phone was on or something. All right, great. Okay, never mind then. That's embarrassing. Okay, so we can also see this illustrated geographically, right? This is showing kind of a similar concept. So these green areas are all concentrated areas of poverty that overlap with certain racial concentrations. So up here on the top left corner, we see the Portland metro area. These are the green spots we see in North Portland. This is where the majority of the Black and African American population is located in the Portland metro area. And we have another little green square out in Hillsborough. So in Hillsborough, there's a very large concentration of migrant farm workers that are majority Hispanic and Latinx. Similar situation out here in Ontario. So this is on the Idaho border, out in eastern Oregon. Also a very large concentration of Mexican migrant farm workers. Salem, another similar situation. And then here on the bottom is really interesting. So this is the Warm Springs Reservation in Central Oregon. So we see this little brown line denotes the boundaries of the reservation itself, and this green area actually lies a little bit outside of the reservation. That is probably because we don't have the same amount of data within the reservation as we do outside of the reservation, but we can still confidently say that there is a large population of Indigenous folks who are living in this area. All right, I am going to pass it off to Marlee to talk a little bit about why we're here, why we got here.
Thank you, Gina. I'm going to stand back here because my notes are back here, but I like to gesticulate wildly, so let's hope I don't knock anything over. All right, so to understand Oregon's current equity disparities, we have to go back in time. Long before Oregon was occupied by settlers, it was home to dozens of indigenous tribes and bands for over a millennium. Most of the indigenous population who lived in what's presently known as Oregon were concentrated near the Columbia River, western valleys, and water inlets along the coast. And these bands were culturally and linguistically diverse, whose ways of life complemented the environments they lived in. Some bands traveled following the harvest and migration patterns of the year, while others settled near the coast to fish and hunt. And it was largely because of this nomadic structure that settlers who moved to Oregon did not see the indigenous tribes as civilized people, as people with agriculture, even though as they were traveling around, they were tending to the land, issuing burns and making sure seeds were spread, and really following those migration patterns. The results of this is the idea of manifest destiny that arises, which is the idea that was espoused by early settlers, that they had an overriding sovereignty over the sovereignty of the tribes that existed in desired areas. This really shows up in multiple ways in Oregon's early plannings. Oregon's early political and economic systems were established with the intention of creating an agricultural paradise in the West. This was their goal, where white farmers could settle without the competition and monopoly of southern plantations. And this vision is reflected in the original state constitution, which banned African Americans from owning real estate or land or voting. And this language was actually not removed from our constitution until 2002, when voters finally decided, yes, it's a jaw-dropping moment, to remove it from our Constitution. In 1849, Oregon passed official legislation known as the Black Exclusion Law to further bar African Americans from owning property or being able to become residents in the state of Oregon. And this law would not be repealed until 1927, nearly 100 years later. So kind of reading this on the slide for you, quote, "No free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall ever come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contract, or maintain any suit therein," end quote. While these exclusion laws were rarely legally enforced, they were on the books, and the message was out to the rest of the country that Black people would not be welcomed or safe here in Oregon. At the same time that these exclusion laws were being made in the early 1840s, there was also the Donation Land Claim Act, which would forever change the trajectory of who would live here. So the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act was thus: 320-acre land claims, this is free land, would be given to any white male who had resided in the territory before December 1st, 1850. So if you were already living here, great for you, here's 320 acres. This amount would be doubled if someone was married. And then if you moved to Oregon between 1850 and 1855, you would receive half of that, 160 acres of free land, doubled again if you were married. You might be wondering, why is this doubled if you're married? Well, the land wasn't going to the wife, if that was one of your questions. The idea behind the Donation Land Act was to provide an incentive for white settlers to come and move to Oregon. Before this, Oregon's economy was primarily fur hunting and trapping. This was a very nomadic type of lifestyle. It was hard to kind of settle. But if they wanted Oregon to become this agricultural paradise that was rich and lush, they needed people to be incentivized to take the long, arduous trail here to Oregon and create farms, create agriculture. So this was the goal. The Donation Land Claim worked. Between 1850 and 1855, 7,437 new land claim grants were made under the law, and many earlier claims legitimized. To put this in comparison for you, in 2019, the average price for an acre of Oregon farmland was $3,000, meaning that white families then were getting a subsidy today would amount to about $2 million. Between those 5 years, Oregon's settler population boomed from 13,000 to 52,000 residents in just 5 years, and millions of acres of native land had now been stolen, occupied by white settlers. Despite the Black Exclusion Laws and the Land Donation Act, there were also Black pioneers who made the trail and made Oregon their home, despite the messaging from the state. One of these settlers was George Washington Bush, who lived between 1790 and 1863, and he settled in Oregon in 1844. He was actually someone who petitioned against U.S. Congress to protect him from Oregon's Black exclusion laws, and he did this with the help of his friends and neighbors. So in 1855, Congress passed a special act specifically allowing him and only him to retain their land claim. So really a truly remarkable story. And I recommend, if you want to learn more about Oregon's Black pioneers, to visit OregonBlackPioneers.com. They're a fantastic nonprofit archiving these stories, and you can learn much more about folks and their history. Okay, there we go. So in the 1850s, right, Land Donation Act has passed, 1850 to 1855. We also start to see an influx of Chinese immigrants moving to Oregon. Between 1861 and 1863, large numbers of Chinese immigrants moved to eastern and southern Oregon following the discovery of gold. And these were mostly young men hoping to earn money and send back to their families. By the 1880s, the Chinese were the largest minority in Oregon. And in fact, here in Portland, we had the second largest Chinatown in the United States, second only to San Francisco. It's a little hard to believe now as you walk through, it's a little hard to believe as you walk through Old Town today. Many of the early Chinese immigrants here in Oregon built a lot of Oregon's early infrastructure. They mined, created railroads, built bridges, tunnels and roads, dug canals, built canneries, and almost always lived in segregated Chinatowns. And this was because of an increase of anti-Chinese hate and harassment, which we'll talk about in just this next slide. Okay. So in 1859, Oregon passes a new law that prohibits the Chinese from owning real estate. And this is also in the Oregon Constitution. So just as we had black exclusion laws, there was also a clause prohibiting Chinese from being able to own land similarly. In the 1880s, there was an economic depression that kind of wiped across the United States and hit Oregon as well. And as so often we see throughout history, when there are economic times of depression and hard times, people look for a group to blame, to scapegoat. And in the 1880s, it was the Chinese who were blamed for taking gold and taking jobs that were not theirs. And this propaganda was widely spread. This led at the federal level to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which lasted from 1882 until 1943, which placed immigration quotas on Chinese immigrants wanting to move to the United States. This act would not be repealed until 1943 when China became our ally in World War II. Convenient. There was also increased harassment against Chinese miners, robbing of their gold dust up and down the coast, quite a bit of anti-Chinese violence located in eastern and southern Oregon, Snake River Massacre, which occurred in May 1887, where 30 Chinese miners were killed and their gold stolen from them. And so the result of all this hate and harassment led to Chinese immigrants moving away from rural areas to urban centers for relief from the violence they were experiencing. And this is similar to other trends we see as other groups of Oregonians were experiencing similar levels of hate and harassment. So when discussing Oregon's history in the early 1900s, we have to talk about the existence of the KKK during this time. The KKK had quite a bit of influence on Oregon's policies, and oftentimes this is something that's not taught about or explained. So when we're reviewing policies passed in the 1920s, which was the height of the Klan's power here in Oregon, we need to remember that many law enforcement members, policymakers, governors, mayors were endorsed by the Klan and actively working to support Klan agenda and policies. So how many of you have seen the film Birth of a Nation or are familiar with it? Unfortunately. So this film glamorized the KKK and ignited a cultural obsession with this Klan, portraying them as protectors of America and the American dream. The first official KKK chapter in Oregon was established in 1921 in Medford by recruiter Luther Powell. And by the end of the year, Oregon had nearly 50 Klaverns and the largest KKK membership per capita in the nation. So the Klan was not this rogue group of extremists here in Oregon. Klan recruiters targeted middle-class, everyday citizens, such as Protestant clergy, law enforcement officers, and local leaders. In 1922, regular Oregonians demonstrated their overall support for the Klan when they voted 11 Klan-endorsed state legislators and a governor into office. And the Klan really capitalized on fears associated with increased immigration in the early 1900s, stoking fears that immigrants would take over jobs, lower wages, or whose different religions and customs would quote-unquote threaten the 100% American way of life. Does any of this sound familiar today? And what the Klan wanted was an America that was entirely white, Protestant, and in their words, native-born. In Oregon, the Klan primarily targeted Jews and Catholics, despite the state only being 8% Catholic at that time. It was 90% Protestant. They boycotted Jewish businesses, brought forward an initiative to outlaw private Catholic schools, and competitive white farm owners in Hood River formed an anti-Asiatic association, and with support from the Klan and the Oregon chapter of the American Legion, promoted the passage of the Alien Land Law, which we've seen now laws in Oregon's history that prohibit black residents and Chinese residents from owning land and property. Well, now the Alien Land Law would target Japanese residents. So this would prohibit the leasing of land to the Issei, or first-generation Japanese. And the Japanese had begun to move to Oregon following the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So when Chinese laborers can no longer come to the United States and fill in those labor gaps where white workers didn't want to be doing those jobs, Japanese immigrants were then moved in to fill in that gap. And we'll talk about that pattern more in just a bit. The results of the Klan being so prevalent here in Oregon was also the time that sundown towns went into existence. Sundown towns, if you're not familiar with the phrasing, were towns with laws not written on books, but instead just posted on signs. And really these signs expressed hate and harassment for any non-white travelers who happened to be coming through. Laws would often say, keep moving, or you're not welcome here, and would force people to keep moving through the town or leave altogether if they weren't white. This is a map from justice.tougaloo.edu. You can find it if you just type in map of United States sundown towns. Here I have zoomed in on Oregon, and I'll read some of these darker red dots. And these darker red dots represent cities that we know for sure were sundown towns here in Oregon. Those include Oregon City, Astoria, Salem, Toledo, Florence, Eugene, Ashland, Tillamook, Milton, and Grants Pass. More likely, sundown towns also include Coos Bay, Roseburg, Oak Ridge, Dallas, Albany, and McMinnville. I'll also state that many Clatherns were established in these towns that later became sundown towns. Clear connection there. This here is a newspaper clipping from a Grants Pass newspaper that says, quote, "Let's keep Grants Pass a white man's town." The Klan used more violent methods of harassment as well to maintain sundown towns. They had night rides, cross burnings, and necktie parties, which were used to threaten victims out of their homes. Sundown towns pushed black residents out of rural areas, and by 1930, 28 of Oregon's 32 counties had 0 or less than 10 black residents. More than 20 Oregon cities and towns, including Salem and Eugene, had these sundown laws. In places like Cottage Grove and Cave Junction, sundown laws remained posted on city perimeters as late as the 1970s. So what we see here in the 1930s, following the rise of the Klan and these sundown towns, is a movement of black families and laborers away from rural Oregon towns towards more urban centers like Portland. This here is a picture from a family album found beneath an Albina home circa 1945. But here in Portland, Black residents would face different types of discrimination and were restricted to certain areas of the city. This followed similar patterns of immigrant enclaves during this time. So we talked about how the Klan rose in opposition to rising immigration rates. Well, by 1910, nearly 14 million immigrants had moved to the United States. Most of these immigrants were Eastern and Southern European immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. And as more and more immigrants traveled to the U.S., there was this extreme nativist reaction. Nativist propaganda instilled fear within white Americans of immigrants competing for jobs and that their different religions and customs would threaten the American way of life. This here is a political cartoon from around that time. I can't quite find the year this was made, but you can see the words riff-raff immigration, Uncle Sam holding the flag of liberty to try and protect American ideas and institution. So, in response to the rise of nativism during this time, we see many policies put in place to prevent immigrants from being able to access similar economic opportunities. The 1923 Alien Land Law, which I mentioned earlier, and the 1924 Immigration Act. This was a federal act that placed quotas on immigrants from different countries. So you can't really see here. Let's see if I can zoom in for us. Oh yes. Wonderful. All right, so these are for the year 1924. This is the amount of immigrants from each country that were allowed to move to the United States. What can we see here? Well, we can see in the green, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, 65,000 immigrants allowed to immigrate to the United States. India, 100. Germany, 25,957. Let's see, China, 100, right? So these quotas existed largely in place until, I want to say 1965. Thank you, Gina. So what we start to see in that graph is how nationality begins to translate into a hierarchy that we can trace, right, with numbers. And this hierarchy is kind of grouped together by religion, by race, by color, by national origin. And we see this reflected as well in some of the housing policies that come out during this time. So this is a list used by American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers from 1920 to 1940. And it lists the most to least favorable housing homeowners. So you can see in this list, English, Germans, Scottish, Irish, Scandinavians are at the top. And then it goes Northern Italians, Bohemians or Czechs, Poles, Lithuanians, Greeks, Russians or Jews, lower class, Southern Italians, Negroes, and Mexicans, end quote. You can notice some things with this list. Native Americans are not even mentioned on this list. You also might be wondering to yourself, why are Northern Italians placed higher than Southern Italians? Well, this is believed, it was believed at the time that Northern Italians typically had lighter skin tones. So you begin to trace how color, right, plays a role in who is considered a desirable tenant, a desirable homeowner, a desirable resident, right? So we have to ask ourselves, who's making these decisions, right? Who's creating all of these paper hierarchies that we can follow throughout history? Well, the large answer to that question is the Federal Housing Authority. The FHA played a large role in the enforcement and perpetuation of segregation. During the Great Depression, the FHA innovated homebuyer practices to increase access to home ownership and wealth creation. So before this innovation, you would put 50% down and then spend about 5 to 10 years paying that off. But after the FHA innovated home buying practices, you would then buy a home with 20% down and pay the rest off a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which we're very familiar with today. And this opened the door to home ownership to millions of Americans. But the federal government used this same appraisal list to decide who had access to these loans. Of $120 billion given out in FHA loans between 1934 and 1963, less than 2% went to non-white applicants. This meant communities of color were unable to accumulate home equity to pass on to their children and grandchildren. This is a quote published by the FHA in 1936, their underwriting manual. It says, quote, "Incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities." This is official guidance from the federal government at that time. And they enforced this through two primary ways. The first were restrictive covenants. These prevented the owners of real estate to sell or transfer property to black people or other racial minorities and various religions. It was believed that integrated communities would cause a decrease in home values. It would also introduce crime and unrest, violence to the streets. These were largely myths that were perpetuated by these very policies that exist. Yeah, it's just a whole cycle. Racial covenants were agreements made between local real estate agents that ensured non-white populations were kept restricted to specific neighborhoods. So in older homes, there may be language in the deed that says, quote, "No Negroes, mulattoes, Japanese, Chinese, or Orientals, whether born in this country or elsewhere, may purchase or rent the home, but can occupy as domestic servants," end quotes. If you own an older home here in Portland, it's likely you'll find this in the deed. These are unenforceable now thanks to a very important case called Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. But because fair housing laws were not created at that time and no enforcement mechanisms for fair housing law were established until 1988, it's likely that these deeds continued to influence who lived in these neighborhoods. Many entire communities were restricted by these covenants. We've seen one example from the Mock Crest neighborhood. We also see examples in Cedar Hills, Raleigh Hills, Lake Oswego, Grant Park, Hillsdale, Palatine Hill, and Laurelhurst. So even when black Portlanders could afford to buy a home in a majority white neighborhood, they were not permitted to do so by real estate agents sworn to preserve the property value of that neighborhood. This is a quote from a restrictive covenant, I think is from Mock Crest. But it says, quote, "No person of any race other than those of the Caucasian or white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant." Other ways that segregation was enforced during this time was by referencing FHA terms as a qualifying factor for a home. So in the 1940s, for example, the housing subdivisions Astor Heights and Byers Addition in Astoria were built with racially restrictive housing covenants added to the original titles. They also, I'm getting ahead of myself. They also included the phrase Federal Housing Administration terms to their advertisements for those housing developments. This may not seem outwardly discriminatory, but if you dig into the history of what that means, you'll see what they're referring to. So adding the Housing Administration's terms to ads was a point of exclusion because during World War II, the Federal Housing Administration was subsidizing subdivisions with homes that were only allowed to be sold to white people. So this was kind of a coded way to say, hey, this is going to be a white-only community. Redlining is another idea that was promoted by the Federal Housing Administration manual, which promoted the idea of de facto segregation, that people want to be segregated and integration will bring instability. Through redlining, neighborhoods would be rated by the population of people of color or new immigrants who lived there. If you're from Portland, this is a little grainy, but you can more or less find your neighborhood on here. I'll point out a few on here. The red on the west side of the river, this is largely Old Town, Chinatown, and there was also an immigrant enclave where the Keller Auditorium is located today. On the east side, you see that red neighborhood, that's largely Albina, Alberta, crossing over. We also see more Eastern European immigrant communities located a little south as well. Green, you guessed it, Laurelhurst, right there in the middle, and surrounding it some of those other Eastern neighborhoods. So this rating system was used to deny loans and homeowners insurance to redline areas which were deemed as dangerous investments. The FHA manual also suggested, were you going to say something? Okay. Also suggested the use of transportation improvement projects to create physical boundaries and barriers to reinforce segregation. One example of this is the construction of the I-5 in Portland, which demolished a poor and predominantly black neighborhood. So this graphic kind of takes you through the history of these transportation urban renewal projects that were built. The red you see were the existing black-owned homes and neighborhoods. And as you can see with each new project, we see Interstate 5 is created, wipes out a whole strip of red. Memorial Coliseum, you see Water Bureau Shop, Emmanuel Hospital, which is created or was to be expanded and never was. And it just continues to take out parts of these neighborhoods. Urban renewal projects didn't just happen in Portland, it also happened across the state. One example is in Eugene's Ferry Street community. So on July 16th, 1949, residents of a small community on the north bank of the Willamette River received a 10-day notice from the city of Eugene that bulldozers were coming to demolish their homes. Because of restrictive covenants, like we talked about earlier, black residents of Eugene weren't able to actually live in city perimeters. So instead, they built homes and communities on the other side of the river. These communities did not have access to many amenities. They lived in dirt floor shacks, cooked food on open fires, drew water from nearby rivers. The houses and church were wood framed and covered in canvas tent roofs. There was no electricity or running water. The Ferry Street community was referred to by locals as Tent City or just across the bridge. And it was the only place that black residents in Eugene could safely live in what was otherwise known as a sundown town. So on August 24th, 1949, residents watched as a bulldozer flattened the community that they had made there. The bulldozer is also recorded to demolish spaces beyond the proposed radius, leaving unprepared residents scrambling to save their belongings. And for some families, the demolition of the Ferry Street Village was their fourth relocation ordered by the local governance. We see this also here in Portland, where segregated communities are forced to move where the government and city tells them to live, and then urban renewal projects, transportation projects magically pop up in those same neighborhoods, forcing them to move even further out of city limits. We see this in Albina. Originally, many black residents here in Portland were living kind of between the post office and the train station located downtown until 1930 or so, when folks began to move across the river to Albina. And this was largely because of pressure from the city and a depression where they could no longer afford to live on that side of the river. And then once they lived here in Albina, there were projects like the expansion of I-5, the Emmanuel Hospital expansion, the Keller Auditorium, these repeated urban renewal projects that continue to force residents out of their homes and more towards east side Portland. The man all the way On the right of the screen, this is Sam Reynolds. He was a resident here at Ferry Street Village, and he's recorded as saying, quote, "If ever I was to build a city, I would for no one party or one nation. I would build for anybody, and the more different the races, the better I'd feel. I'd feel like a king." Sam Reynolds went on to be president of the local chapter of the Congress of Racial Equity, which sought to end housing and job discrimination against blacks and other people of color. Okay, so I'm now going to pause and give the microphone back to Gina to talk a little bit about World War II.
Yes, we're going to start talking a little bit about World War II. So kind of up until this point, we've gone pretty much in chronological order when we're talking about these events. When we get to World War II, there's such a wide impact that impacted so many different communities in such specific and unique ways that we're gonna kind of go by community and talk a little bit about how World War II impacted specific racial groups. So many of us, of course, are familiar with Executive Order 9066, but we're going to go back in time a little bit to discuss the history of Japanese Oregonians here in Oregon. So prior to 1942, when Executive Order 9066 went into effect, Japanese Oregonians grew the vast majority of the produce in the state of Oregon. They grew about 99% of Oregon cauliflower and broccoli. They grew a majority of the strawberries, about 75% of peas, as well as a majority of celery and onions. As Marlee mentioned earlier, we do have the Alien Land Law of 1923, which prevented Japanese Oregonians from owning land in their own name. It also prevented Japanese Oregonians from becoming citizens after they had moved here, specifically the Issei population, so those who were first generation coming from Japan. The result of that was that Japanese Oregonians started purchasing land in the name of their U.S.-born children or of non-Japanese friends, so they could still be successful agriculturally, right? However, that land was often not owned in their own name. Prior to Executive Order 9066, there were about 4,000 Japanese Americans living in Oregon at the time. There were large areas of immigration. Hood River had a large concentration of Japanese immigrants living there, as well as areas of Marion and Polk counties. There were large areas of immigration there. So Marlee talked a little bit about the Chinatown in Portland. So prior to Chinatown being a Chinatown, it was a Japantown. So it was a rather large Japantown where we now recognize as Old Town Chinatown. So the process of that happening was that it was originally a Japantown, and then after Executive Order 9066, when Japanese and Oregonians were forced from their homes into concentration camps, Chinese Oregonians moved in, right? So that's when it became a Chinatown, right? Prior to that, it was known as Nihonmachi, or a Japantown. So, Executive Order 9066 occurred after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, where President FDR ordered all people of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien was the language that they used at the time, which means citizens and immigrants, from their homes to report to evacuation areas or detention centers. He did this without any legal review, and at the time it was justified as military necessity. However, a later investigation in the federal government revealed that there was no military necessity, obviously. Duh. So areas within 100 miles of the coastline were considered high security areas, and that is where folks were forced to evacuate from. So if in Oregon, 100 miles from the coastline is Highway 97. So if you lived west of Highway 97, you would need to report to a detention center. Here in Portland, that detention center was the Portland Expo Center, which at the time was known as the Portland International Livestock Exhibition Pavilion. So it was essentially, if you have been to the, I'm sure most of us have been to the Expo Center, if you go all the way to the far side, those kind of smaller buildings, Hall A, which is all the way at the back of the parking lot behind this big statue that's there, was where folks were held from May to September of 1942 in what had been animal barns. So it was like a big red barn at the time. It was all dirt floors. It was converted hastily into what is now, or what was euphemistically known as the Portland Assembly Center. So folks were to report there, taking only what they could carry, and they lived there for about 6 months. So 120,000 people nationwide were detained during this time, about 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens. Okay, we have a couple of videos that illustrate a little bit more some of our speakers on our bus tour. If you've ever been on our bus tour, we go through a lot of this information, but it shows videos of them talking about their experience, their family's experience as well. Oops, we're going to Braceros. Okay, so Okay. Marlee mentioned earlier the cycle of agricultural labor that happened, not just in Oregon, but throughout the United States. In Oregon, it is, I won't say unique, but it's a little bit different because slavery did not exist in Oregon, or African American slavery didn't exist in Oregon to the extent that it did in the South. But the original agricultural stewards of the land of Oregon were indigenous people. The indigenous people were pushed out by the Donation Land Act, and then the people who came in to replace them were Chinese immigrants. Then we have the Chinese Exclusion Law, which pushed out Chinese immigrants. Then Japanese immigrants were brought in to replace those agricultural laborers. Then during World War II, Japanese immigrants were forced into concentration camps. And this left, again, a giant hole in agricultural laborers. And then that brought the birth of what we know now as the Bracero Work Program. So this was a bilateral work program that ran from 1941 all the way to 1964 between Mexico and the United States to bring folks in as contract laborers. Nationwide, over 4.6 million contracts were signed. About 15,000 Mexican men were brought into the United States, or into the state as contract labor. Originally, there were promises of adequate housing, food, and pay, but this did not come to fruition. Housing conditions were poor and often segregated, so some of the agricultural laborers were braceros, others were prisoners of war from World War II. Sweeps began to clear out braceros in the 1950s who had settled in the areas they were brought to work, and we still see this effectively happening now. So because of the Bracero program, the Latinx became the largest minority in Oregon, and we start to see organizations pop up for workers' rights. Unions start to pop up for agricultural laborers. So in the 1960s, we see the establishment of the Woodburn Radio, or the KWRC, the Valley Migrant League, which was effectively a union for migrant workers, United Farm Workers of Oregon, Centro Chicano Cultural, and the Colegio Cesar Chavez were all produced in the 1960s and 1970s to kind of disseminate labor conditions and that kind of thing. So now, Latinx are the largest minorities in Oregon, centered largely around the cities in which they had originally settled, like Gervais, Woodburn, Cornelius, and Nissa. So talk a little bit about World War II and the African American experience in Oregon. Okay. So there were, where do I start here? So during World War II, there was a massive increase in the African American and black population living in Oregon. Prior to World War II, there was about 2,000 African Americans living in Portland, but because we are a port city, we are on the Columbia River, there were shipyards that popped up in both Portland and Vancouver, and because of this, about 20,000 African American people came to the Portland metro area to work in Henry J. Kaiser's wartime shipyards. This is the same Kaiser as Kaiser Permanente, same guy. So during this time, you started to see this proliferation of discrimination in public accommodations happening throughout Portland. You started to see things like whites only signs pop up in hotels and restaurants, other kind of public spaces. Servicemen were also treated differently outside of the Portland metro area. So there was a highly trained all-black unit, the 555th Airborne Battalion, known as the Triple Nickels, was stationed in Pendleton. Their job was to fight forest fires started by Japanese balloon bombs out in eastern Oregon. And folks would often say that they would not be served at local restaurants, and the only local restaurants that would serve them were Chinese restaurants, which is a really interesting example of solidarity that was actually pretty common throughout Oregon at this time. Now, where we had 20,000 new people, that's a lot of people. Where are they all going to live, right? We started to have these public housing projects pop up that were almost always segregated. There were only 2 public housing projects in Oregon or in the Portland metro area that would accept black residents. One was Vanport, which is now the Heron Lakes Golf Course up in North Portland, right across from the Expo Center. The other was Giles Lake, which is in Northwest Portland, if you're familiar with where the Montgomery Park building is. It was in approximately that location. That was demolished in 1951, right? Now, after the war ends. Japanese Americans are released from concentration camps. This does not mean that it was easy for them after this. So there was a large sweep of anti-Japanese sentiment, hate, and harassment during this time. There was massive loss of property. Most people's property was not held for them until they came back from the concentration camps. We're talking billions of dollars of property lost to this population. There was Oregon legislation that prevented the employment of returning Japanese immigrants, and they were turned away from rentals and home loans. There was kind of a similar experience for African Americans at this time. So after the war, those wartime industries didn't exist anymore, and so there wasn't a lot of jobs for African Americans at this time. There was a lot of pressure to leave Portland. The Red Cross even gave out one-way bus tickets to black Americans in Portland at this time. About 10,000 of the 20,000 African Americans who came to Portland to work ended up leaving the state, and about 11,000 stayed. Now, I talked a little bit briefly about Vanport. If you want to know more about Vanport, I recommend Vanport Mosaic is an excellent organization to look into to learn more about this really fascinating city and the story of how all of this went down. We're not going to have a lot of time to get into it today, but Vanport was destroyed in 1948 by a gigantic flood. Vanport at the time was the second largest city in Oregon, second only to Portland. During its height, there were about 40,000 people who lived there, and about 6,000 of those folks were African American. It was built to house shipyard workers, but it continued to exist after the war. People still lived there, but it was destroyed in 1948 and was never rebuilt. All right, so we're going to skip through this video. If any of you have ever seen Mr. Ed Washington speak, it is a real treat. If you want to see him speak, you can go to Vanport Mosaic. They have a website that has some videos and audio clips of him speaking. And if you want to come on our bus tour, please see Marlee after this presentation as they coordinate our bus tour, and you can hear Mr. Washington speak about his experience. And it's really a real treat. Okay, so post-World War II, we do start to see some legislative change, right? So we see this case that Marlee briefly mentioned earlier in 1948, Shelley versus Kramer. What this case did was it deemed deed restrictions, racial deed restrictions, to be legally unenforceable. But that doesn't mean that those kinds of things were banned, right? It was then seen as a private contract matter, and were still enforced that way. In 1953, Oregon passes its public accommodations law. And then in 1957, Oregon passes its own fair housing law, which was passed by Senator Mark Hatfield and was the first of its kind in the nation. In 1957, this only applied to public housing, but it was amended in 1959 to apply to all housing. And even so, until the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and even after that a little bit, realtors and landlords continued to segregate and steer immigrants and non-white populations. Discrimination continued in public accommodations, and sundown laws continued into the 1970s. And a note that I want to make about that is sundown laws were posted on signs until the 1970s. We know that there are still cities and towns in Oregon today that are, in effect, sundown towns. Even though those things are not posted or openly spoken about, this is the reality. So then we get, of course, to the Civil Rights Movement. In 1968, we see the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act. This was the most difficult piece of civil rights legislation to pass Congress, more than the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The act, and this was because, at the time, white people believed that a person's home was their castle, right? That the government shouldn't be regulating private transactions like home ownership and things like that. It was different from public accommodations, right? The act addressed both discrimination and segregation. The original 4 protected classes were race, color, religion, and national origin. It was passed prior to Dr. King's funeral after his assassination, because there were riots in the streets of 125 cities after Dr. King's assassination, and that created the political pressure necessary to push the Fair Housing Act through. However, even though it was passed in 1968, there were no enforcement mechanisms that existed for 20 years. 1988, with the Fair Housing Amendments Act, added several protected classes and instated enforcement mechanisms like attorney fees and damages and things like that. Okay, now I'm going to hand the mic back to Marlee to wrap things up.
Great. Thank you, Gina. So what I really hope you walk away here today with is an understanding of how history repeats itself. When we look at some of the core legislation, right, that was passed throughout Oregon's history, we see some themes that pop up. There is a theme of white supremacy. We see this through the creation of the Donation Land Claim Act, which granted land subsidies only to white and married individuals. And we also see this through subsequent policies that are passed, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Alien Land Law, right? We don't necessarily talk about this in this presentation, but in 1954, Public Law 558 was passed here in Oregon, which stripped massive quantities of land and federal recognition from Oregon's tribes, who then had to work tirelessly for the next couple of decades to reinstate their federal recognition, leading to the tribes we know today in Oregon. Some tribes have never had their recognition reinstated, and because of this, they continue to lack access to their homelands and federal benefits as well. Thank you, Gina. We also have Executive Order 9066, which created incredible economic disparities for Japanese and Japanese Americans here in Oregon and across the United States. And then we have the Fair Housing Act of 1968, amidst all of these hundreds of years of policies. And we continue to see how history repeats itself. One could say that the 2017 Executive Order on Refugees and Travel Ban definitely represents a similar trend we saw with the Immigration Act of 1924, which established quotas on certain countries and nationalities. We can also see today how current ICE deportations that continue against federal judge orders are representative of similar trends we've seen of minority groups being brought in to stabilize a difficult economy and then are being pushed out and then criminalized and given consequences for that. Many of those who are experiencing rights deportations today do not have criminal records. They also have families. They've created lives for themselves here, and they are being deported without due process. This is something that we see happening today, reminiscent of the sweeps we saw in the 1950s following the Bracero program. So here we see how the past meets the present. We've talked today about how Oregon's history has always included discrimination, segregation, displacement, and intimidation. We see how Oregon is a majority white state by design, how these policies and practices and history inform the demographics we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, and why Oregon is unique for that. We also see how segregation is the result of federal complicity. The myths of people want to live with quote-unquote their own kind, to live with people of similar religions and customs. This is largely perpetrated by the government to hide the federal complicity we see through the use of the Federal Housing Administration and redlining, restrictive covenants, etc., and urban renewal projects that we use to create physical boundaries of segregated communities. And we see that the result of all of this is that people of color in the United States have less wealth than white people because of these intentionally racist policies. This has enduring effects. If you are not able to buy a home and then pass that home down to your children and grandchildren, you are not accumulating wealth. Buying a home and owning a home is the number one way to building intergenerational wealth in the United States. What happens if for decades, if for hundreds of years you were denied that opportunity? That leads to the disparities we're seeing now. The Fair Housing Act is a start. Oftentimes during our bus tours, which Gina and I help lead, we get asked the question, what can we continue to do today? And the Fair Housing Act has parameters for building equality. We see this through the establishment of protected classes: race, color, national origin, and religion. These are the first four that were passed in 1968. And throughout the years and amendments, as more and more trends of discrimination are identified, we see additional protected classes added, like sex, familial status, and which includes families with children and disability. Here in Oregon, we have some additional protected classes. We have the protected class of marital status. Immigration status was added through SB 2599. SB 599, thank you. And this new law states that immigrants cannot be treated differently in housing interactions because of their citizenship status. This is huge. I think there is a whole presentation on it tomorrow, so I will be there. I hope to see you there as well. Source of income is another protected class, which protects people using housing vouchers and subsidies like SSI, SSDI, TANF, and other agency rental supportive checks. Sexual orientation and gender identity, while no longer protected at a federal level, remains protected here in the state of Oregon as a protected class. And we also see actions made to expand protected classes at local levels. The city of Salem has housing status added as a protected class and joins the ranks of only a few other cities in the nation that protect people against discrimination because of their history of discrimination, or if they have a history of being unhoused or insecure housing. Fair housing issues continue to persist today. We at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon receive over 2,000 contacts of discrimination every year from across the state. Half of those bona fide fair housing claims that we receive are related to issues of disability. This includes housing providers and landlords discriminating against people, not allowing them to have reasonable accommodations, reasonable modifications, retaliation against them because of assistance animals, etc. We also see increases of harassment in our fair housing cases as we see those cases of harassment rise across the nation, right? So that also impacts fair housing cases. And we also see fair housing issues in issues related to home ownership, HOAs, and continuing effects of gentrification. There are groups that are doing some incredible work that we would like to shout out. The first is Coalición Fortaleza, which is the first ever resident-owned community located in Southern Oregon. They presented here a few years ago, and their story has always stuck with me. NAYA here in Portland, Native American Youth and Family Services, thank you, have some really wonderful culturally specific housing as well. And Albina Vision Trust is doing work to physically stitch the neighborhood back together. They've recently received a quite hefty grant to begin this project, and I think their first apartment complex opened over the weekend. Very exciting. But there's so much more that we can do. The Fair Housing Act ensures discrimination is illegal, and our work is to make sure that people have equal access to housing. Equality is not the same thing as equity. We know this. So there's still work to be done to address those long-standing inequities we see perpetuated throughout history. So what can you do? We ask folks at the end of our bus tour to ponder and think through these three questions. And they talk in groups about this as well. But we want them to think about how they can contribute their time, their money, and support public policies to advance this work. I love ending with a quote from Maya Angelou. She says, quote, "The ache for home lives in all of us, the safe place where we can go as we are and not be questioned." After today's plenary speaker during lunch, I think it's really resting on our minds as we think about the rise of authoritarianism. What does it look like when the government has overreach in determining who has access to what? What does it mean to advance fair housing in a time of rising censorship? I hope that you take this history that you've learned today, implement it into your work, share it with your colleagues and friends and family to help you understand a bit more about the communities and neighborhoods that exist here in Portland and the work we still have to do today. If you would like to learn more, you can go to our website. We also offer two historical opportunities. The first is Fasten Your Seatbelts. It's been a bumpy ride. This is available for different organizations, groups, churches, community clubs, and you can join us as we visit locations where gentrification, urban renewal has occurred, and listen to speakers who lived in those communities and can tell us a bit about what life looks like there before luxury high-rise apartments. We also have our Anywhere But Here display. This is a museum quality display. It's 7 panels that we ship out throughout the state to different organizations who want to host it that include this information on it. And yeah, we have only about 5 minutes left. I don't know if that's enough time for a Q&A. I think maybe we can do one question, but before we go, I do want to encourage you to fill out the evaluation forms that are on your table. This helps our funders know that we are doing our jobs, and also we take into account folks' feedback to adjust our presentation to your needs as well. I think we don't have time for all right, we don't have any time for questions, but Marlee and I are going to stick around if folks have questions for us individually. Thank you so much for being here with us today.